On a cool June evening in 1892, the gas lamps in the marble hall of Marble House in Newport cast a pale sheen over the gilded balustrades. Outside, the Atlantic murmured beyond the high wall that Consuelo Vanderbilt would later call my prison. At a small table near a tall window, a girl of 15 bends over thick cream stationery, the Vanderbilt crest catching the light. She pauses to adjust the pearl buttons on her kid gloves before taking up her pen again. The note is a carefully worded thank you to a Newport matron. The phrasing echoes those in the model letters her governess has marked in pencil in the margin of a handbook. Downstairs, Alva Vanderbilt's footsteps ring on marble as she directs servants through another round of preparations. Upstairs, the girl signs only Consuelo, as if the surname were understood inevitable. In a later memoir, she would write simply that in these rooms she became what was required. The gloves tighten as she folds the note. The gesture is graceful. It is also a rehearsal of obedience. In early January 1877 in Manhattan, the shutters of 10 Washington Place were drawn as Cornelius Commodore Vanderbilt lay dying, his fortune estimated at around $100 million, more than the U.S. Treasury held at the time. The rustle of black silk and the creak of stair treads marked the movements of his daughters, but the decisive gesture belonged to his son William Henry, who would inherit most of the estate. Nearly a decade later, William's son William Kissam Vanderbilt and his wife Alva Erskine Smith commissioned Richard Morris Hunt to build a French Renaissance chateau at 6960 Fifth Avenue, a house meant not merely to shelter, but to proclaim arrival. The New York World estimated that the 1883 housewarming costume ball cost at least $250,000, an event deliberately staged to force Mrs. Astor's recognition of the family. In a photograph from that night, Alva's gloved hand rests lightly on a fan, her expression composed and triumphant. The house, the ball, the gloves, architecture and ritual fused into social strategy. In a nursery just above the ballroom, an infant daughter slept under embroidered curtains, already an asset in a dynasty of intent. By the summer of 1884 at idle hour, the Vanderbilt estate on Long Island, the sounds were softer. Cicadas in the trees, oars knocking against the side of small boats on the Connequot River. Consuelo, now a little girl, later remembered this rambling wooden house as her father's domain, a place of rare ease where she and her cousins played in an old bowling alley converted into their playhouse. Even here, discipline was never far. A French governess monitored lessons in the shade of striped awnings, correcting verbs as the smell of river mud drifted in. A surviving family photograph from idle hour shows the child in a white dress, one gloved hand resting on a wicker chair. The other hand is hidden, the pose already formal. According to later biographers drawing on Consuelo's own memoir, The Glitter and the Gold, Alva insisted on a steel posture brace that ran down her daughter's spine and fastened around her waist and shoulders. The device was meant to perfect carriage. It also turned the simple act of standing into a daily discipline. Years later, Consuelo would say that her happiest memories were of a nearby farm, precisely because no one corrected how she stood. By autumn 1892, Marble House on Newport's Bellevue Avenue had been completed, a Beaux-Arts summer cottage, costing some $11 million, with about $7 million spent on marble alone, and requiring a staff of 36. In the morning, the Atlantic fog pressed against the windows while coal furnaces hummed below. In the afternoons, footmen opened heavy draperies just enough to admit a controlled wash of light across gilt chairs and damask. For Consuelo, now in her mid-teens, the house felt less like a seaside retreat than a stage set. In one oft-quoted recollection, she described her bedroom there as gloomy and austere, a space stripped of personal objects so that she herself became, in her words, a finished specimen framed in a perfect setting. On her dressing table, a set of silver-backed brushes gleamed beside a pair of pale gloves laid out like props. A surviving calling card, Miss Vanderbilt, engraved in looping script, speaks to the social machinery already in motion, Each call, each carefully timed carriage arrival, was part of the architecture of acceptance that Alva pursued. When the surf roared loudest beyond the garden wall, it was the only sound in Marble House not scheduled by someone else. By the 1890s, the daughters of America's new industrial fortunes were being groomed as dollar princesses, their education designed less for employment than for alliance. Social arbiters, such as Ward McAllister's 400 lists, elite girls' schools like Miss Porter's in Farmington, and an army of governesses and dance masters created a curriculum in which French subjunctives and perfect curtsies had measurable exchange value. It was refinement as capital. On a gray January morning in 1891 at the Petit Chateau on Fifth Avenue, the sound of carriage wheels on wet cobblestones drifted faintly into the schoolroom. Consuelo, now 14, repeated French phrases after her governess while a music master waited in the adjoining salon. Her timetable allowed little room for idleness. French, German, history, piano, and once a week, a dancing class with the renowned instructor Mr. Dodsworth, who had taught generations of New Yorkers how to behave in company. Between lessons, she practiced penmanship at a small desk, gloved hand guiding the steel nib across thick paper. A notation in a later biographer's footnote records that there was never any swimming, tennis, or golf on her curriculum. What was absent from the timetable mattered as much as what was present. One afternoon in the early 1890s, in a dressing room thick with the scent of starch and perfumes, Consuelo dared to protest a particularly severe gown her mother had chosen. According to historians citing Consuelo, Alva's response was immediate and chilling. "I don't ask you to think. I do the thinking. You do as you are told." A mirror in the room reflected mother and daughter. Alva in a richly embroidered bodice, gloved hands decisive, Consuelo pale, lips pressed together. Here, etiquette fused with authority. Clothing choices were not simply matters of taste. They were tools by which a mother could enforce the persona she intended to present to the world. By late spring 1894, Newport's season was approaching. In Marble House's mirrored ballroom, a photographer adjusted his cumbersome camera. The resulting portrait shows Miss Vanderbilt in a lace dress, gloved hands resting lightly on an ornate chair, gaze calm and slightly distant. Behind the frozen image lay hours of rehearsal. In her memoir, Consuelo would recall learning to smile without showing fatigue, to hold herself so that jewels sat correctly and gowns fell in approved lines. The society pages praised her slim, tight appearance. In print, the smile looked effortless. In practice, it was a learned response to scrutiny. By the summer of 1895, the dollar princess economy had settled into recognizable patterns. American heiresses brought dowries, often in railroad or steel stock, into British aristocratic families whose estates were rich in land but poor in cash. Consuelo's home-based schooling emphasized French and German, music, and the history of European courts. Alva hosted dinners where her daughter was expected to converse politely with visiting diplomats and titled Europeans. In one letter, later quoted by a historian, Consuelo confessed, "I am learning my role." The word role is telling. Education had become rehearsal for a part written by others. On the morning of 6th November 1895, St. Thomas Church on Fifth Avenue was transformed into what the New York Times called a floral fairyland for the wedding of Consuelo Vanderbilt to Charles Spencer Churchill, 9th Duke of Marlborough. Outside, carriage wheels clattered on the pavement. Inside, candles glowed against banks of lilies and roses. The society pages recorded the spectacle: the Worth gown of ivory satin and lace, the long train carried by 8 bridesmaids. In the glitter and the gold, however, Consuelo remembered another scene. "I spent the morning of my wedding day in tears and alone." When she finally descended the staircase, she adjusted her gloves with shaking fingers. In the Vatican court, decades later, Alva would summarize that day with a single sentence: "I forced my daughter to marry the Duke." By late November 1895, the new Duchess of Marlborough had arrived at Blenheim Palace in Oxfordshire. The stone facade, streaked by centuries of rain, loomed above frost-silvered lawns. The marriage contract that brought her here was explicit. William Kissam Vanderbilt had provided a settlement valued at $2.5 million in Beech Creek Railroad stock for the Duke, with a guaranteed annual income of at least $100,000. British newspapers noted bluntly that dollar princess fortunes were restoring country houses that might otherwise have been sold or abandoned. In private, as she later wrote, the Duke told her that he had married to save Blenheim, not out of love. At Blenheim, every step she took on the checkerboard floors echoed across both a rescued estate and a sacrificed youth. During the London seasons around 1900, Sunderland House, the Marlborough's London townhouse financed by Vanderbilt money, hosted dinners where royalty and politicians mingled beneath glittering chandeliers. In these rooms, Consuelo's education bore visible fruit. Fluent in French, comfortable in court circles, she became a favored hostess. At the dining table, gloved hands arranged cutlery, signaled servants, and emphasized points in conversation. The same gloves that had once been adjusted in a Newport schoolroom now helped manage alliances between American financiers and British peers. Yet in private correspondence, Consuelo began to express restlessness and unhappiness. The more skilled she became at arranging others around the table, the more she began to ask, quietly, where she herself belonged. By October 1906, the London press was reporting the formal separation of the Duke and Duchess of Marlborough. The corridors of Blenheim fell quieter as the couple began to live largely apart. The separation, while painful, also opened a narrow path toward autonomy, charitable work, suffrage sympathies, and eventually the prospect of a different marriage. 2 decades later, in August 1926, when the Duke sought a Catholic annulment, Alva traveled to give evidence. Her statement to investigators was stark. "I forced my daughter to marry the Duke. I have always had absolute power over my daughter." When the transcript of Alva's testimony reached Consuelo, it turned a private wound into a documented fact. On 4 July 1921, in a quieter ceremony in Paris, Consuelo married French aviator and industrial heir Jacques Balsan. The setting was modest by Vanderbilt standards. Sunlight filtered through open windows. The scent of summer streets and cut flowers replaced incense. By then divorced from the Duke, Consuelo divided her life between Balsan's chateau at Saint Georges Motel in Normandy and later Casa Alva in Manalapan, Florida. In these years, photographs show her in simpler gowns, gloves still present but shorter, more practical. Her 1953 memoir, The Glitter and the Gold, was both a nostalgic and critical record of the world that had formed her. When she described her girlhood bedroom at Marble House as a perfect setting for an object, she was, at last, choosing her own words. In 1973, nearly a decade after Consuelo's death, 120 descendants of Cornelius Vanderbilt gathered at Vanderbilt University for the family's first reunion. Reporters noted that not one of them was a millionaire. By then, the great Fifth Avenue chateau had been demolished, and most of the Newport cottages had become museums. Tour guides now lead visitors through ballrooms once closed to the public, pointing out baccarat chandeliers and marble bathtubs. In the gift shops, reproductions of Giovanni Boldini's portrait of Consuelo are sold as souvenirs. In an archival photograph taken late in life, Consuelo sits in a simple chair, hands bare, a book open in her lap. The Vanderbilt millions are gone, but the posture remains. No brace now, only habit and choice. In Marble House today, visitors pause before a glass case displaying a pair of ivory kid gloves said to have belonged to a Vanderbilt hostess. The leather is faintly creased at the fingers, as if someone had just tugged them tighter before stepping into the light. The gesture, once a rehearsal of obedience, lingers now as a question. How much of a life can be contained in what the camera shows, and how much lies folded, quietly, just beneath the skin?